So before we get on with the episode, I need to jump in and let you know something that we forgot to record, which is we have one last live show coming up. This is the last show ever on our Year of the Smile run. We are going to be down in Austin, Texas, Austin, Tejas, on April 15th. We're going to be at the Far Out Lounge. Young Chomsky's performing. You can get tickets at the link. And this is going to be the last time we do this version of this show ever. We're not doing it again. And we're not recording. We're not putting it out there. This is it. So if you want to see it, if you want to catch it before it's poof, like gone forever, floating out into the morass of forgottenness, come on down and hang out with us in Austin, Texas at the Far Out Lounge, April 15th. It's like in 2 weeks, which is crazy. Or I don't know, maybe it's next week. That's crazy too. Unless you're listening to this in the future, in which case, damn, you fucked up. You missed out. So you know how we were doing we were listening back to our old episode?
Yeah.
When we were talking about the old episode titles?
Yeah.
And then I remembered the first episode we did with Noah was called Jew Detective.
Jew Detective, yeah.
That's a great title.
I know. And, we really brought back that ancient form of figuring out someone's race by the shape of their nose, too.
Oh my God.
We re-pioneered that in that episode.
And look at how it's caught on.
It's huge now.
Well, that's the nose.
Yes. Hello, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello, I'm Liz.
My name is just a little brace. We are, of course, joined by our beswaddled producer, Young Chomsky.
No, that's not that episode.
No? Okay, fuck. All right, well, actually, you know what?
No, don't even.
No.
Don't do it. Brace.
There's been a
stop.
lot about adult
Please
baby
stop.
diaper lovers in the press
This is
lately.
TrueAnon.
Happy Passover!
I had this crazy woman approach me on the way here, by the way. Purple coat, purple pants, purple shoes, purple socks.
It was Barney.
And she was like, excuse me, is it Easter on Sunday? And I was like, it
Yeah,
is.
he's
It is.
risen.
It is Easter.
What does she
this
want?
Sunday.
What does she want?
Why is she wearing purple?
He's not here. We did away with him. If you live in the John Wick world, and listen, if somebody knows it, I've looked up for a brief minute, tried to find out the answers to this. I could not. If you live in the John Wick world and you are a John Wick guy, like you're an assassin, who are you assassinating? Who is your
Here's
target?
the thing. So you're like obsessed with this problem, but only because you haven't seen the other people in the universe that could be targets.
Have I
right?
heard them mentioned?
Right, but you're saying you're assuming that they don't. It's just they're somewhere. There's somebody.
There is an extraordinary amount of money, of spiz flowing around in the John Wick universe. I mean, these guys have palaces, for Christ's sake. And my question is, so obviously they operate above the level of any government or international organization, right? But where is the fund? Where are the funds coming from, and who are they killing to get this powerful?
First of all, obviously, one, Bitcoin.
Yeah, Bitcoin.
Two, I don't know, man. It's a movie.
Yeah, I know, but we're at the fourth one now, and my other question here is the John Wick Assassin Hotel.
That's so corny.
You hate the Assassin Hotel.
I think that we were saying this before we started recording, but I'm going to repeat myself because I think it's true, and I want to share this with our listeners, which is that John Wick, excluding the first one, because I think the first one is very, very good.
Yeah.
And then second, third, and fourth. Well, I haven't seen the fourth, but I assume it's they've sort of live in what is now called the John Wick universe. Whereas the first one is the standalone little movie, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course it exists. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Anyway,
No, fully.
But so in the second and third one, the aesthetics of the movie are walking this real fine line between, or basically what I would say is some kind of fashy, almost futuristic Euro vibe.
Yeah, it's very European.
It's
very
welcome
European.
to Brussels in the
Yeah.
future. It rocks.
Are you bisexual?
Yeah.
Yeah. But then
Yeah.
it's you go to the hotel and it's oh, now it's cyber. It's like
We're in the past.
Yeah, it's
Here's
steampunk.
the pocket watch.
It's steampunk,
Something-
and I'm like, I'm not here for that at all.
Something I noticed, and I don't want to, no spoilers for you guys, okay? But for
You
John
can
Wick 4,
spoil. I'm not one of those people.
a lot of pocket watch chains in there. We don't see a lot of pocket watches come out, but there's a lot of guys wearing fully buttoned vests with chains on their motherfuckers.
But is that a wallet chain or a watch chain?
You're not wearing the wallet right there. First of all, they're all
Oh, it's
digital
up
wallet.
there.
Yeah. For these,
Now a wallet chain
don't
would
get me
look
started on
great
money
in the John Wick universe.
A wallet probably RFID.
That would be sick as hell.
RFID.
I gotta say, one of my most like normie ass, the Ringer Podcast Network ass opinions about movies, and I've held this for like 10 years and counting, is that there should be a crossover between the Magic Mike universe and the Fast and Furious universe,
that'd be good.
where Magic Mike stripper team teams up with the family to like fight car crime or whatever.
yeah.
And there's some erotic
commit
dancing involved.
car crime.
And I feel like that would make a lot of sense for everyone involved and would be very fun. I was thinking about this, whereas like with John Wick, what I want to see is the John Wick crossover into the Lydia Tarr universe.
Oh, okay.
And that would be fucking...
Yeah, you
First
want
of
to
all,
talk about
John
who they're
Wick-
assassinating?
They kill Lydia.
Yeah,
you
they
want
kill
John
Lydia
Wick to
Tarr.
kill
Well,
Lydia Tarr?
no spoilers, no spoilers.
Okay.
But
Oh.
I think John Wick in Lydia Tarr, but
Yeah.
then Lydia Tarr in John Wick.
Oh, that's good.
Do
Well,
you think John Wick could
boom.
make Lydia Tarr straight? I
Oh
think he
no.
could.
no. Well, I haven't seen Tar, but I get it.
Yeah.
My thing is, what would be sick if John Wick? She's a concert lady, right?
Conductor.
Conductor.
Train
Maestro.
conductor.
Maestro. She's a maestro. Check this out. John Wick, silenced pistol, right? He sees the bad guy on the balcony, and John Wick is looking in the reflection of Lydia Tarr's podium, her conductor's podium, in the metal, because it's like a stainless steel, because we're in Europe, and he sees the reflection, the glint of a scope, and he goes back and goes pew, pew.
But see, here's the thing, is that in the John Wick universe, that scene would have like burgundy velvet drapes and a like Russian maestro
Yeah.
with a ballerina. Like it would be like so way too over the top theatrical. Whereas if it were in my version of how the John Wick universe and ex Lydia Tarr universe should be,
No,
it would be
it's-
like in the UN.
You're like making it premium. You know, you're talking like
Yeah.
like Deutsche Grammophon. John Wick,
Yes.
you know.
I think John Wick's lawyer, Michael Clayton. That'd be sick. We need to get Michael
Oh,
Clayton in there as
shit.
his lawyer.
Do
Yeah.
I
That
look
is a
like I'm
great-
negotiating?
Yeah, and
Now
him-
that is a
that'd be crazy. Could you
You could-
imagine
you
those
know
two
what?
having a conversation?
you could
Oh,
go
the
on
Baba
the
Yaga.
ringer.
He's walking
could,
over there.
I could easily be on. Well, I don't know what the ringer is, but I could easily be
You
on
got to
it.
float that opinion on there.
100%.
Bill Simmons is going to eat that shit
My
up.
idea, though, before we get started, this actually segues us kind of nicely into the topic of today. My idea for a complete, you know how they try to make a Bob Odenkirk John Wick, one of my most hated movies I've ever seen in my
Third
entire
episode
life.
in a row you've mentioned
I know,
this.
but it really genuinely pissed me off. I don't see very many movies. I saw that movie. I did not like it.
You've seen more movies than I have this year.
They need to make John weak. Like a little guy who really, I don't want to be doing this. You know how
this is terrible.
You know how John Wick throws the gun after he runs out of bullets? This guy immediately throws the gun underhand at somebody to try to make them catch it, and so that they get distracted. And he's just like, "No, you wouldn't hit a guy with glasses, would you?" And just running and running and running and running and running and running. John Wick. I think it would really be, because there's like a lot of people like myself who are physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, sexually weak. And we need a role model of like a weak guy who's also not strong.
And just running
What about
away.
Jared Leto?
Jared Leto, unfortunately, due to his sexual predilections, I can't look up to him. However,
Also his height.
How tall is he?
I think he's a short guy, isn't he?
I don't know. I'm
Hey, he
5'2".
reads short.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he
he's-
reads
he's-
short. All
he-
famous people are short.
Yeah, he's short to me.
Yeah, except for famous women who are always tall.
Yeah.
That's cap.
Well, I'm thinking of just
Famous women are either tall or short.
yeah.
Yeah.
But never mid.
Never middle. Never
You're
middle.
either like
What is middle height?
You're
Oh,
either
no.
like a 5'2" or you're 5'10".
Or you're 6'3".
Yeah.
Yeah, Brittany Griner. Well, we've brought Noah Kulwin in the studio, which is actually our bunker that we shelter in near Tel Aviv in case there's rocket attacks that come in at us. Just playing. We are here in the Brooklyn podcast food court, right in the middle, microphone set up at the table to talk about a subject near and dear to our sparts. I almost just said hearts. Let's go with
Are
Israel.
Sparts?
I don't know what I was going to say with that. I don't know what Brooklyn podcast lunch food hall means either, but just you know what I'm talking about with that though. Can you see? No, I mean food hall like
smorgasbord?
Smorgasbord food hall.
Wow.
That's what our studio looks like.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it reeks of shellfish.
That famous Brooklyn barbecue.
We only serve clam sandwich, lobster sandwich, crab sandwich, and we got a guy right over there making them, and it stinks in here. Noah, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you back in person.
Yeah, I am thrilled to be here in person. The studio is lovely.
I wish you were wearing a shirt, but you know what? Can't win everything. Why are you here?
Israel.
And if memory serves, and my eyes do not deceive me, there's been a couple of funky things going on in Israel.
That's
in the
right.
past few months.
The Israeli government, which has the recently formed Israeli government, is led by the most right-wing people to ever lead a government in the history of Israel, which is,
Hundreds
no
of
small
years
feat.
old.
Yes, exactly.
Thousands
yeah,
of
it's
years
actually
old.
thousands.
Excuse
yeah.
me.
This is the most right-wing leadership since Judah Maccabee.
Wow.
I mean, so and the inciting event, as it were, this time around for why people are paying attention to it at least, is because the Netanyahu-led government decided to push through legislation that would effectively make the courts within Israel answer to the legislature.
Yeah.
They would take away the court's right to have, judicial review over legislation.
I think we need to back up here a little bit and go way back in time to Israel's founding in 1948. So one thing Israel doesn't have, along with Britain and like 4 other countries, which I think mostly are other Commonwealth countries.
Yeah, sense of dignity.
Yes, and lacking a constitution.
Correct.
And, I was always told in PE class when I was walking the mile that Jews do lack constitution. I thought they were just talking about me, but in fact they are talking about the very state that I hold citizenship to. So Israel, as far as I understand it, Noah, you know probably much more about this than I do, but when Israel started, they were like, all right, we're going to do a constitution, but later.
Like, we'll get to it.
We'll get to it.
I swear, we're going to get to it.
Not everyone's here yet. We got to get way more guys over here until we can do a constitution.
Yeah.
They're like, we're going to do a constitution. Swear to on God. Well, G-D. But we're not going to do it right now. It is now 2023, and there is still no constitution, right? Because this constitution, to me, again, not a legal scholar here, seems pretty important for the formation of like laws and stuff like that.
Yes, I think in the case of Israel too, where you have it's ostensibly a parliamentary democracy, and we're talking, of course, only about within the state of Israel. We're not talking about the millions of people, millions of Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza, which are under de facto Israeli military control and or bombardment.
Yeah.
And in the case of the Constitution in Israel, they decided, we're going to kick the can down the road, but we're going to have a stopgap. And like many grand political compromises intended only to last a short while, it has instead lasted the entirety of the existence of the state, which is that there are 5 basic laws. There's no need to know them individually. The important thing to know, though, is that 5 basic laws a constitution do not make.
Yes.
And so there is, I would say, as it relates to this current crisis, a little bit of, overheated rhetoric about like how there is this is stripping away the last vestiges of democracy within Israel.
Let's put quotes around that for a second.
Yeah, because it's a little bit, it kind of ignores the premises on which Israel was set up in the first place and has continued to be, particularly since 1967, on the premise on which the state has operated. I think that the significance of this development, if it's not just about like, is democracy dying in Israel, what it is that, on a practical level, the courts within the Israeli political system are essentially the only thing that has kept the Israeli political system from going beyond what other countries, other governments, international bodies would consider the bright red lines. things like, annexing Palestinian territory outright and making it part of Israel and demanding it to be internationally recognized as such. Certain treatment of Palestinians even more harshly than they already are in terms of, bringing back the death penalty. There's a wide variety of, things that come on the table that otherwise would not be if the courts are, essentially castrated. And that is, on a practical level, not a great outcome.
No.
But if we're really talking about like what is happening, what is changing in the character of the Israeli state, I would argue that this coalition is in effect, bringing out it's like sucking out the cum of Israel. It's getting its true essence most purely. You've got like a government that is actually really attempting to lead Israel toward a truer purpose of what the government is set up to do than what the government has been in before, which is, has had, truthfully, been stopped from pursuing some of the most aggressive, and genocidal policies against Palestinians.
Well, I think that's an important point because in the kind of classic, let's say, pro-democracy argument, when you start to see the kind of classic authoritarian slide or whatever, like these kind of like political science types like to talk about, what they're usually referring to is when like courts are emboldened or strengthened, right? In the classic, like Poland, for example, that happened, or in other countries, in Brazil, right, where you're seeing kind of like sweeping use of the courts to kind of usurp sort of,
hell, in America, yeah.
This is a sort of different formulation because the politics in Israel are quite different.
And also, I would say that in the case of the courts, it's because the courts are secular. Like they're a secular, they are like just like they have some intellectual and philosophical foundation in Jewish precepts, but like they're not religious courts. The judges are not rabbis.
Yeah.
But
the people who lead this government, many of them, if not most, want those people ultimately down the line to be rabbis.
Well, and like the elected leadership in parliament is quite right wing.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
So as Israel's political system overall, right? It's a unicameral parliament.
Correct.
Meaning they just have one fucking house. And the party that has the most seats and can gather a coalition gets to form the executive branch.
Correct.
Right?
And you have to form a coalition, it's 60 plus 1 because there's 120 seats. And traditionally, but not always, the party that comes in first will get the ability to form a coalition. However, the way it works, and this is, again, like it's all of this stuff is basically, you're describing like, well, it's supposed to do that. There's no constitution. There's not like a lot of formal practices or formal instructions that outline this. The president, who is the formal head of state, but who really does not have powers beyond this specific function, he then invites somebody to form a government, and he'll invite for whomever there is the most obvious path to form a majority coalition.
Gotcha.
Now, 60 plus 1 is a very, like in Weimar Germany, for example, a notoriously stable government, you could form minority governments. Like they had governments, led by the Social Democrats, for example, that, were able to, rule and continue to hold power even though they didn't make up a majority of the legislature. In Israel, 60 plus 1, if it's under that, the government falls, you got issues. Government falls, you got to form a new government. That's why Israel recently has gone to elections so many times. And so if you already start from, you got 120, if you are the right wing and, you're, let's say, you're not going to form a coalition with Arabs. And if you're the center and the left, or if you're some parties are not going to be in coalition with others because they want different things. And so you end up in the process of catering to smaller blocs that are just either not going to participate like Arab Israeli parties.
This is always the problem.
It's always the problem. I think the issue, now is they've got it, especially as it relates to this legislation, is that they are, this to me is, I brought up Weimar for a reason because I do think that this is like this is part of the process of how you see like an actual like authoritarian slide, if not quite a one-party state, but like truly this unworkable parliamentary system, widening inequality, an enormous amount of ethnic like anxiety, to put it mildly, that's just clearly going to become genocidal ferment.
Yeah.
It's very, to me, it's this law is very reminiscent of the emergency legislation to me that was passed in the years before Hitler ever became chancellor.
So, like Bray said, let's back up for 1 second, because we should talk about the election that put this coalition together.
Yeah.
Right? That was just last year. The Netanyahu government was sworn in January, I think.
Yeah.
So it's only been a couple months. There's basically been nonstop protests since then.
Yes.
And the Netanyahu coalition is basically Netanyahu himself, very famous, I would say right wing.
Yes.
And yet his coalition, further right wing. I'd say ultra nationalist, ultra orthodox. Ultra
well, it's a mix of
right-wing
both. Yeah, it's like
It's a combination. So there's secular nationalism in Israel is largely expressed through the Likud, which is Netanyahu's party. And the other parties, are varying degrees religious, or varying degrees nationalist, but like the fusion, there really are, let's say Shas is the most famous example, religious parties whose primary constituencies are other religious people as well as charity for the poor. And I think that if you look at parties like that, like they have increasingly become more comfortable and open to a lot of what people would think of as like the excesses of Netanyahu, because they have similar problems.
Yeah.
They have leaders who face serious corruption charges and investigations. They have people who are also, like they're dealing with the same kind, Netanyahu's not such an exceptional figure. He's just the most exaggerated in terms of the like sort of political needs that are sort of forcing his hand, as he would say, in terms of trying to avoid prosecution and whatnot. The other thing, as far as the nationalism goes, is that the settler movement and the religious settler movement is becoming increasingly powerful in ways that even a few years ago, I think people were not, really starting to, were not opening their eyes to. People like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is, just like was somebody who was not allowed to participate in politics for many years because he was by the police because he was too radical.
I want to pause on Ben-Gvir for a second here, because he's a pretty important part of this story, right? So Itamar Ben-Gvir is the Minister of National Security, which I gotta say followed the TrueAnon rules there. However, the way that Israel's government and police are set up, not fully. It's not exactly the same as an interior minister position. However, and not kudos to him, he's a bad guy, but he is following the rules here. He is trying to create his own private police force. I will say, Ben-Gvir, it made some pretty big news that he was a member of government. Like there was international news stories about it, because I'm trying to think of the equivalent to Ben-Gvir in like another country, but I will, and I'm kind of
J.
failing.
Hoover.
Yeah,
no, I mean I'm kidding, not really, because he's not a surveillance guy. But it's like, but he's like, he wants to be a force within the state that I don't think that there has been somebody who's attempted for many years, because Israel, as a state where like the military has primacy in every state. Let's not kid ourselves. But in Israel, it has extra primacy, and and that means military traditions includes a fair amount of turnover, that people don't just like stay in charge, et cetera. Like the idea of somebody trying to set up like an individual power center within the Israeli state, that's a fairly novel development, at least this overtly. And in the case of Ben-Gvir, he wants to create his own brown shirts. He wants to, and these are, by the way, these are all aspirations. Like the same way with this law. Like they announced, by the way, this is broken out into protest over the last month. But because, as you were saying, Ben-Gvir is so controversial, the process has been arrested somewhat because there is such a substantial backlash.
Yeah, I will say though, like I'm just to give listeners who might not know who he is, like a picture of Ben-Gvir as a person. For many years, up until I think just a couple of years ago, he had a picture of Baruch Goldstein above his desk, which, without going too much into the details, is the exact same thing, I think it's safe to say, as having a picture of the Christchurch mosque shooter over your desk.
Like one.
Literally, it's a 1-to-1 comparison. The guy did the exact same thing.
Yeah, the guy shot up like a
mass shooter.
Yeah,
he went into
the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron, Muslim holy site that is today surrounded by the most rabid and extreme Israeli settlers.
Yeah. And he killed 25 people praying, and he shot 125 other people, wounded them. This is a mass murderer, a spree killer, and Ben-Gvir has a portrait of him hanging over his desk, pride of place over his desk. I mean, Ben-Gvir's politics, like you said, were so extreme that they wouldn't even let him join the army. Like
they said that we don't want people like that, and this is also where now the army has over the last 30 years. But been in a process of introducing more and more religious units.
Yeah.
They're trying because, it was to them, they don't want people so there's there's a couple things here, this is also a great illustration of the dangers of having compulsory military service in a given country, which is that if you create this one institution that socializes everybody and then you have a bunch of people who exist outside that institution, then how do you reach them?
Yeah.
And so in this case, it meant that we're going to create these divisions and so on, brigades that will let in these religious, Zionists and nationalists. In fact, if people have seen the movie or the series The Boys or Our Boys on HBO, one of the directors of that, Joseph Cedar, he made a very good thriller movie in the 90s about a bunch of young religious settlers who planned a terrorist attack in Jerusalem. And there's these, which is only to say that these are not new issues, and that religious infiltration of the army, in addition to bourgeois government, is now. And I don't mean to say religious in such a catch-all way. I don't want to be glib there. These ultra nationalist, ultra religious figures. In the same way that they have risen to prominence in the legislature, they have now acquired substantial purchase within Israel, and the big within the military. And the big important point here, and the reason that the military in Israel can be conquered like this and cannot, fend off some kind of ideological takeover from without, is because the primary mission of the Israeli military is exactly the portfolio of the ministry that Ben-Gvir has given himself, national security, which according to the Israeli military means maintaining the military occupation of the West Bank and maintaining the blockade around Gaza. And that mission basically means that they are, their job is to protect settlers, maintain the area for them. And while a lot of the soldiers hate this job and a lot of the military leadership thinks that, this is, it's a disaster, et cetera, a lot of people, and you can see videos of, senior Israeli officers, getting lifted up by the same people who are launching pogroms in East Jerusalem or in Hawara. You see, truly, there's a reason that these pogroms were happening all the same, recently just as well. There is a real ferment, a real dangerous amount of power that has, gone to the far right in this country. And it's not just, in the Knesset, it's not just in the legislature, it's among the military, and it's among, the masses, among people who feel empowered to go, into Palestinian communities and fuck them up.
Well, on the flip side of that, then you have these quote unquote, and I'm going to say that a lot, probably pro-democracy, kind of liberal, progressive-ish protesters that are getting, really lionized, I'd say, in the Western press. There was so many glowing tweets and profiles and pieces all over the papers and the Twitters and whatever.
They're saving Israeli democracy.
Yeah, that's a hard word for me to.
Well, they are technically for themselves.
Listen, it's a good thing as long as we just say that Israeli democracy is just kind of
it's you can differentiate that from democracy.
Yeah, exactly.
Writ large.
It's
Israeli democracy.
It's like how a lieutenant general is not really general. He's kind of lower.
But I do want to like talk about that a little bit, because that is one of the big tensions within the country right now, is that you have this kind of, I mean, for lack of a better word, like, I don't know, like metropolitan kind of.
Blake Flayton.
What?
Blake Flayton.
I mean, there is a lot of like tech workers, right? The tech sector in Tel Aviv is fucking massive, and we can talk about that for a little bit. I mean, there was a lot of profiles about tech workers walking out of jobs, of these kind of like very wealthy, Tel Aviv residents going out in the streets to protest against these judicial reforms.
Yeah, but listen, the startups that they're working for, they're how you say, they're for women. They're pussy startups. They're terrible. They're not doing. They're the real money. The real money in Israel, and like the macho Israeli thing is that like the tech industry there, it's not civilian. It's not like these sort of. It's not like Facebook and stuff. Like a substantial chunk of it, far more than in the U.S. is not just downstream.
Oh, it's spy. It's spy technology.
It's part of the military.
Well, yeah, of course.
And so this is where it's like that degree of civilian protest is, it's sort of like, okay, like, will the workers at Krupp factories, revolt against their Rhineland bosses?
Well, no, I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, it's inherently limited, and I want to talk about that because it really fucking pisses me off.
Yeah,
I know,
the
kind of coverage that this gets, because it's like, okay, the entire Israeli tech sector, which really came into its own after, I mean, look, in the middle of the Second Intifada, right, Israel's in a huge depression, basically. You had the huge, like, blow up of the U.S. tech sector in 2000. Tourism dies in Tel Aviv, basically, in the mid-2000s. And when they're able to kind of resurrect in this tech sector, it's because they are building massive surveillance tools and weaponry that they're proving on Palestinians. And they're able to sell them at such high prices because they're able to go to countries which are now like, shit, we got to, we need weapons contracts now that we're, there's a wake of 9/11. And Israel's kind of rising in this moment to offer this because they can show you, hey, look, we've used this on the Palestinians. This fucking works. That's the legacy of the tech sector, right? That's who built these people who are quote unquote pro-democracy protesters. And so the limitation that's built into this, I'm sorry, it just like really makes me like.
No, I mean, it's
really tough for me to fucking stomach this shit in the Western media when I see this kind of stuff.
Well, I think too, it's
without
funny.
that context.
It's funny. I will say, like, the past couple years, the Israeli sort of like spy tech sector, I think, has become so large that it's becoming basically impossible to ignore. I mean, there was all those like long investigations.
There's a story
The
that just
Guardian.
came out that is that's also worth seeing about how there was I think it was in the it was in the New York Times, and it was about how even though the U.S. government is right now, its official position is that they are working to shut down NSO's Pegasus spyware, which it's an Israeli product that allows governments to spy on people without them knowing. And it's like the bleeding edge of international spyware. There are shell companies that are being used to create and get licenses for Pegasus, where we know that the end user is still the U.S. government.
Yeah.
Right.
So there is a truly there is a subterranean power network that is really what like binds the U.S. to the leaderships of Israel, Saudi Arabia, Dubai, and so forth. And to your point, Liz, I think that in the case of Israel, like the bourgeois Jewish society in Israel is extremely, it's hurting. Its numbers are declining. Many of the people who can leave the country for decades, they have. There is a real sense that this is, as they feel it, the last opportunity that they have to keep their country being, as something like what they remember.
Yeah.
And of course, I don't think that that's a fairly realistic proposition. But I think that there's not really like.
But to be clear, when you say something like they remember, the threat being like that it's taken over by religious, like crazy religious fundamentalism,
yeah, they don't,
not that it's because they let the Palestinians in and have
which
an
is
actually
means
secular state.
which is like and if Israelis were if Israeli political life was a serious place, and it is not. But if Israeli political life were a serious place, then I think that the real basis of inquiry into how the fuck did this happen would obviously begin and end with, well, it's because we've just sort of made the whole country on like a burial ground for Palestinians. and we have this, aggressive, it is clearly linked that the forces of reaction, far reaction, of high, of the most aggressive retrograde forces imaginable have been empowered by the, enhanced military propaganda, hyper-nationalism that has been required for Israel to maintain that state of subjugation against the Palestinians. And, that's discussion, it's happening in parts. Like I've seen, the kids burning their draft cards and stuff at protests. And, I've seen, there are heroic individuals in small groups, but it's they're just that. They're not Leninist cadre small groups either,
Yeah.
Well, I think I want to actually talk about real quick what exactly Netanyahu and his coalition is trying to do to the courts, right? So the government basically is you have this unicameral parliament, you have, the prime minister and his coalition, and then you have the courts. And the judges, as far as I know, are not they're not nominated in the same way that they would be in America, for instance.
Yeah,
we're all familiar with Supreme Court judges being, but this happens to federal judges on all levels. Being nominated and then being interrogated, all this stuff, blah blah blah. Not how it goes in Israel, and so that was. And this has been sort of a bugbear of the Israeli right for quite a long time. I think there's a few factors that show why this is really coming to the fore right now. But one of them is that some of Netanyahu's coalition partners, this is a really big issue for them. And so in order for them to really have his back, he needed to make this basically a binding clause for getting in the coalition, for coming into government. We will pursue this and we will get this done.
And the Israeli courts are in the same way. I mean, and historically, courts in the American South, for example, the federal courts were the enemy for about 100. I mean, they probably still are in many respects. Consent decrees and all the to enforce, enforcing school integration and things of that nature. Obviously not just in the South, but that is the kind of antipathy that these figures have for the courts. Because, as Brace is saying, it's a more credential, professionalized thing. People who get to work in the Israeli high courts tend to be people who are, secular Israelis who are, I mean, again, it's yes, you could chalk it up obviously to cultural and ideological differences, but, it really is, a sort of I think unwittingly perhaps it was a really effective class barrier, or static class position within the Israeli government, even as the Israeli government's, social majoritarian social base that constituted its, parliamentary, democracy changed over time.
So what's happening is Netanyahu is trying to basically make it so that judges, and this is really focused on the Supreme Court, are nominated by the government.
Yes.
And this has been not received very well.
Well, and there's also the the idea is that the plan or that the legislation is in and of itself a path toward, and this is clearly what they want, is ending judicial review.
Yes,
because the courts it's there is a the letter of the legislation is it's bad enough as it is, but I think what is just as scary to your average liberal is sort of quote unquote democracy minded Israeli is this idea that the courts are going to cease to do anything other than the most perfunctory of details.
Yeah,
and I think that it's a very real possibility because this reform it has been stopped, it has been delayed only a month, basically because there has just been such outcry and because the protests in Israel right now are unprecedented.
So what led to these specific huge outpouring of protests? I mean, there's been protests basically for the past few months, but what led to this huge upsurge in protests is Netanyahu fired, but not really fired. Said he was going to fire. He said he was going to release him.
It was a warning shot.
It was, exactly. It's you're fired, but we're not actually, there's no
the
paperwork
defense
or anything.
minister.
Defense Minister Gallant. And which I got to say, great name if you're going to be a defense minister. Because let me tell you, when
you don't want Goofus up there.
I was about to say, Goofus was horrible for Israel. My God.
So Gallant he's not a good guy.
No.
We don't like him.
You're saying the defense minister of Israel isn't a good guy?
We don't like him. No. He's a bad guy. And he is his firing, however, was sort of seen as like it's also funny. It's one of these things where Netanyahu says, "I'm going to fire him," and Gallant says, "I don't accept."
Yeah.
And Gallant is basically.
By the way, great move to say when you're when you get fired.
Yeah.
Just
People
say,
don't know
I don't
this.
accept.
You can say like, "Oh no, I'm good."
Yeah, it's
thank you.
Or or a George Costanza. Just pretend he didn't quit.
Go,
Pretend he
go
didn't
back
fire.
into
Go back
work.
the next day.
Go back into work.
Build that bed under your desk.
Yeah.
Live your best life.
And so in the case of Gallant, it's like he is speaking for the army establishment, which is like, again, another sign that you live in an amazing and healthy society is when the military is, speaking through its civilian leadership in winks and nods to say that they're not going to abide something further. And, this is like you've now seen a whole bunch of like leaders and high-ranking soldiers in the Israeli military, and all people say that they're not going to do reserve duty and all this stuff.
The pilots.
Exactly, because they're
listen, we're not going to bomb truckers
and so
in
Gallant,
Syria.
never actually got like the formal paper or whatever.
Yeah.
So they've just basically, and Netanyahu hasn't rescinded. So they've decided like, this true, like, I mean, this is such like bullshit banana republic crap, but like they've just decided that we're putting the firing on hiatus, we're putting the judicial reform on hiatus, even though, it's possible that like one could be undone and one won't, and you could probably guess which is which. That like the judicial reform has a very strong chance, if not an outright likelihood, of succeeding.
Yeah.
Because it's not like there are tools that can stop it outside from public opprobrium. And then the other thing is that, like Gallant is if he can be convinced, if the army can be made convinced that, there is some kind of, fake compromise or something, they'll buy it.
So that's kind of what I assume is going to happen.
Yeah.
Is a fake compromise, because that's what Netanyahu, after this entire this public outcry, a lot of bad press for Israel here. Netanyahu comes out and says, like, listen, we're going to put it on hold, like you said, for a month, and we'll have some talks, right? We'll come to a compromise. But, and again, I'm speaking, I'm not saying this is morally good or whatever, but this is realpolitik. If he's doing the thing that you should do if you are in his position, he will basically do a fake compromise, because I'm sure they've already thought of this, that there are things that they're willing to take out or whatever that won't affect generally what would happen and would still please the people,
or we'll find out that like the Gulf's like, because this is the other thing, like America, which is also, again, like we try to, we maintain the position of sort of refereeing a lot of Israel's shit in private and in public, and also in conversations that don't involve Israel. Meaning that like it's entirely conceivable to me that the Israeli government, the Abraham Accords were considered the Israel doing good and doing right.
Right.
That like, not that like, which is fakakta, because obviously these Abraham Accords were a huge fucking dub for Israel that didn't have to give anything up and is now on a path towards normalizing trade relationships with the wealthiest countries that are surround it. And that previously hated it. And so, and so on. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if they'll be like, okay, like we'll also just in the same way that like Israel's like decades-long feud with Morocco, that's sarcasm, was resolved through the majesty and of negotiation of the Americans, they'll find some other bullshit to do it as well, and they will try and put some lipstick on this pig and then hope that like, what happens next won't be so bad, which I think is, I'm not sure how that'll work out, because it does seem like this will be pretty bad.
Well, I mean, you said the protests were, I think you said this, but if you didn't, then I'm just going to pretend you did, that they were pretty unprecedented and pretty serious.
Yes.
And I mean, I will say, like, Netanyahu, when he backed down, he did seem spooked. He said that, I think the government seemed a bit spooked at the reaction. And they said they wanted to like prevent a civil war, like using those words, which is like a pretty, that's pretty harsh language. You don't want to be throwing that out there.
I do think that, because I can get away with it and because I do think it's important and historically just, I do think that, like, again, like some of like the Weimar and Nazi comparisons are important here, because if we're talking about like, a progressive drift of policy and government toward genocide, which is what I think is, the case in Israel. Like there's a genocidal intent to get rid of, to wipe out, to cleanse Palestinian populations. I think that part of how it's going to get there is that, these unprecedented people, in the same way that like, people who wanted to ultimately seize the power of government to carry out those sorts of policies, they didn't want to do it in a popular national revolution. They wanted a legalistic means by which that could happen. So again, like, what is the point of, let's say they get a fake compromise on this bill, right? So, and to mollify the protesters, but just to mollify them, to maybe facilitate their brain drain out of the country, to facilitate their economic drain out of the country, and that leaves room open for favored right-wing people to take their positions within the civil service and within the professional sphere. Like, this is there's the contradictions that compose Israeli society at the moment can only be resolved through their like a exertion of horrifically violent energy on the Palestinians around them. And that is, the question to me. And
but that's always been the case.
No, but what we are seeing now, what I'm saying is that the fullest, most deadly capacity of that is that is what's up for debate. That is what's being contested over right now. And one of the ways that it can happen is because all of the people who we've just now seen in the streets are going to feel so politically marginalized because the country is so far gone that they're going to put up even less of a fight. It's going to become a very I think that it will become a very all of this freak out right now may end up being for naught. And that's I don't think that's a good I don't think that bodes well.
Well, you mentioned the U.S. and how we've always been the kind of I don't know. Handlers is not the right word, but we always had our hands in there, let's say.
Yeah.
Mixing it up.
Messing around.
Yeah, we're always around. Let's talk about I don't like saying let's talk about the U.S. and its relationship with Israel during all of this, because we were talking before we started recording that, the relationship between the U.S. and Israel since the Obama admin has undergone lots of change. Things have changed.
Yeah. Well, really,
over the past, whatever it's been, 20 years?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
15.
15.
So, it's Netanyahu is, he is a meaningful, if not, he's not a transformative figure because I don't in Israeli society or history, but he is one of the things that he did augur was the way in which Israel became openly willing to play, to get in the mix in domestic U.S. politics. And what he figured out was that, we can always get more for ourselves, and I can shore up myself domestically if I dump on the Democrats, and in particular, Obama. And that became, that feature of Israeli political life has not gone away. Because no longer do some of the people, many of the people protesting in the streets in Israel, I do believe, feel very strongly that Netanyahu has fucked up the relationship with Biden or something.
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is that what he's really done is created this template for how people can get the most out of the United States government, how Israel can get the most out of the United States government with not having to concede a fucking inch on anything that it wants. And so, that at this moment, I think, Netanyahu and Biden's in particular relationship has never been that strong.
Yeah.
Especially because Netanyahu picked on Obama so much and, went and delivered an address to Congress basically shitting on the president.
Yeah.
Which is, again, fairly unprecedented stuff. So, Netanyahu is not winning any friends. However, Obama negotiated and got a 10-year, $38 billion military aid package for Israel.
Yeah,
so Israel gets
that's the thing is that there's some things that are non-negotiable in politics.
Yeah.
One of those is, it is negotiable, but it's it negotiates up. Is how much money we're just going to give Israel. It doesn't really matter. Netanyahu could be Joe Biden is a pedophile. And Joe Biden would have to be all right, I'm sorry, here's $15 billion.
Well, it would be listen, I'm not, Bibi, he may say that, but I love Israel.
But Yair Netanyahu, for instance, Bibi's beautiful son.
Immaculately behaved. By
the way, podcast, Yair Netanyahu and the Bolsonaro boys, crazy good podcast. That's a Ringer Network podcast. Right? But Yair Netanyahu does actually have a podcast, and he's been saying that Joe Biden is essentially behind this color revolution in Israel, which is but the White House released this sort of very I mean, it's the exact sort of statement you'd expect the White House to be put out. Like, we're watching these developments, and like we believe in the strength of Israeli democracy.
Yeah.
And it is just like it's the relationship is like it's strained between like 'cause, Netanyahu hasn't even met with Biden yet. I mean, obviously he hasn't been in power that whole time, but it's unlikely that he probably will. At the core of it, though, and I do believe this, is that like support for Israel is totally non-negotiable. Like we will continue giving them as much weaponry and as many resources as they want. Essentially no matter what.
Yeah, well, and part of is like, look, like there is like Israel has a nuke. Like there's
they do have a nuke.
There are like reasons beyond.
Yeah, there's
like,
some limitations here.
Like and there's a they have a nuke. And what's more, when they buy weapons, right? Like Israel, just like Saudi Arabia and Dubai and all these other places spending money on American weaponry and machinery, like that is part of the system by which like the dollar gets to be the dollar.
Yeah.
And I think that like Israel in particular gets kind of discounted as part of like that, what other people have called like a dollar recycling mechanism.
Right.
And, because it's so small fry or whatever. But when you really look at it, you actually do see that no, these companies and the products they serve are just as much a part of like this defense value chain that is an essential part of like the American trade balance.
Yeah.
And there is, like that is going to be – I mean, look, I think that like the degree to which support for Israel is going to be non-negotiable will change for a number of reasons. And the Palestinian issue will, I think, be remain the primary one. But I also think that, for example, like even if Israel does have a nuke, for example, and all this other stuff, are we going to want to continue to send them our highest, weaponry, our most sensitive intelligence, and all these other things? Will Israel continue to be a customer of U.S. intelligence, not just like in the private sector, but like to use like spy lingo? Like, will they continue to have this sort of a hand in glove U.S. UK style relationship? I mean, don't take fucking anything for granted.
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
Like this is we're living in fun times.
Like there was like some diplomatic cables that were just like leaked recently where there was like some Israeli diplomat talking about the U.S. and saying how like weak leadership was and all of this stuff. I mean, that relationship is really strange.
Yes. And also it should be clear that like, people like a lot of the places like Israel and stuff that are knocking like the U.S. for weak leadership and stuff, obviously like Netanyahu is not a strong leader. He's Israeli state capacity, Israeli everything outside of the military is so fucked. Is so rotted, is so unable to actually like mobilize or have anything except for those like hyper religious nationalist types as a social force. And so the ability I think to really, I mean it can't be overstated how much power and like organization and like capacity within Israel really just exists within this like gigantic, and otherwise sluggish and fucked up bureaucracy that is the military.
Well, I was about to say that though. It's because like, yeah, okay, you might say it's negotiable, like exactly how much intelligence or military stuff we're sharing with them, right? But I do think that like the U.S. probably rightly recognizes the military in Israel as a countering political force to a perhaps destabilizing Orthodox minority who, if they get power, will cause more headaches America would like essentially the status quo that Israel has now, is where they join us in blowing up Soleimani, or they can bomb Syria, or
Syria is the other. You bring that up because that's the other important thing here, and Egypt actually, because Egypt isn't almost Syria, which shouldn't be forgotten. That from the perspective of Israel, which is that like Israel views its borders with Syria and Egypt as basically like gigantic potential problem areas if there's ever serious human catastrophe, like World War Z,
You're
right?
talking migrants.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like, like the World War Z, like stereotype of all the like zombies flying over the separation barrier. Like that is what Israeli politicians and leaders see when they think about Sudanese people and Eritreans, fleeing, fleeing some of the worst conditions imaginable, through Egypt. Like that is what they imagine. And especially as Syria, like as that situation perhaps continues to stabilize now that Assad has reestablished relations with Saudi Arabia and so forth,
He's out walking about. He's chilling, man.
Yeah.
He's
He's
like,
going to meet with. He's going to Saudi Arabia.
yeah, he's fine. He's hanging out. He's taking photos.
Like, there may now be. I think that like the Syrian consideration is, if now that like that is easing, like basically. To me, what's sort of interesting is like the important geopolitical thing that Israel has occupied in keeping those areas, like managing those borders or whatever. Like, will they continue to get to occupy that role? Will Israel just continue bombing the shit out of Syria? Will Israel continue to like effectively act as like a hardcore border guard, in collaboration with Sisi? Will Sisi, like it's a very like the whole point of Israel for American policy is that in a region that has all of these valuable resources and unstable governments, that like Israel is the rock.
Yeah, we got
Israel
a guy.
ain't changed, and we got our guy. And so now if it turns out that like actually, he's our guy, but like he's picked up a coke habit, then like, is he really our guy?
Yeah.
Well, it's also tough because the foreign policy establishment, for the most part, D.C., Europe, Germany, Brussels, France, thinking about all that. Really the liberal internationalist humanitarian blob, right? And running up the problem running up with Israel is you have this like far right, hard right, not the kind of right wing government that can easily be handled or whatever, but like a far right, ultra orthodox takeover that makes it really difficult to kind of sell some stuff even to the public, right? Look at the case with like Saudi Arabia and just how much like public perception has shifted in our, peace partners in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, from the Khashoggi incident being the kind of like inciting one among the public. Yeah. But that relationship was very strained up until that point.
Yeah.
It became too much.
So.
It became way too much to ignore among the like progressive liberal orthodoxy. And you can see the same thing shifting with Israel, which a lot of people have been applauding, but also, like you said, leads to, there's all these contradictions that are kind of coming to a head in a really explosive, volatile fucking, situation on the ground.
And I do think as it relates to will we or will we not change our relationship with Israel and so on, a big geopolitical question. I do think that, again, like the And like in the same way, will we or won't we with Saudi Arabia? It will, if there is some other crisis, like if oil prices go back up really high, if because there's just a possibility that there are a whole bunch of other things that we haven't, that are just like on the horizon. OPEC Plus, for example, just voted to say that they're going to, halt production on barrels of oil because Saudi Arabia needs more money.
Yeah.
Against U.S. wishes. This is a surprise, barrel hike or a production cut and price hike. And so, like what happens if, for whatever reason, 1974 or 1979, those oil shocks, in addition, obviously, to the Volcker interest rate shock. Those are, like exogenous isn't the right word, but like those were incredibly destabilizing, political and, and monetary policies or whatever that, there could be some kind of thing that, we're either not seeing but fundamentally a political decision, like a choice made by policymakers and not just like, force majeure that will, really push people to test these alliances. But, MBS finally goes.
We're already seeing it, not even in the Middle East, like all throughout Europe.
Yes.
Everything. I was reading, what inflation is doing to Europe, what energy prices are going to do to Europe is unprecedented, the amount of destabilizing energy I think we're feeling. I saw like all these bakeries in France are closing because they cannot afford to buy the butter.
No. Well, they use have you seen how they make a croissant? There's a lot of butter.
I know, jokes aside, but the price for it was like €6 year over year, now up €12. It's impossible.
The only people that are still investigating who blew up the Nord Stream evidently are the Germans, and the leads that the U.S. are feeding them are going nowhere.
They'll get to it someday.
They'll figure that out someday. But,
it just happened.
This is the thing though, is right? It's like, Israelis and their American cousins have something in common, which is, again, like we are terrific at talking and saying one thing while we just do another.
Yeah.
And move, and like the more and more the chasm between those two things, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. At least to me, the more violent the rupture will feel when it becomes clear that like, oh shit, we have pushed a relationship too far with one of these countries, or we've brought them in too close.
Right.
And we have, and now we are co-signing something that we have never, our government has never prepared the public for. I mean, seriously, think about how crazy it'll be. If, a government that has been telling, that has been feeding the American public on stories of Exodus and Ari Ben Canaan and, and AIPAC and all this shit for, decades, suddenly has to go and tell the American public, so listen, there are riots in Medina, Riyadh, Mecca, Cairo, because a bunch of Israeli soldiers just decided to light up a bunch of Palestinian worshipers in the Dome of the Rock. There are, this is to me one of the greatest tragedies.
I don't know. I mean, I think they'll sell it fine, or no one's going to pay attention anyway.
I think that there is a to me a real the more and more the further and further our government gets away from being able to transparently sell its geopolitics. And is instead resorting to this crazy scattershot diplomatic game using exhausted Cold War globalization rhetoric, then the tougher spot it's going to find itself.
Yeah, I mean that's the trouble with I don't know, when the rubber hits the road, right? I mean, we joke about the lie in fake news media. I love that turn of phrase, but I will say that more and more, you see the media saying one thing and the reality being completely, utterly, absolutely the opposite. And that can only be sustained for so long.
100%.
In so many
100%.
fucking cases. And I mean, that's, I think you see it very, very clearly in a lot of situations recently in Europe where just the description of events is the exact opposite of what happened. I mean, it's unreality speak. And, we see it more and more in America, but we're so isolated from the world in so many ways.
There's this Lenin
that's
quote
obviously
that I think about
by design a little bit, but
no, there's this Lenin quote I think about all the time. We mentioned it in Blowback once, where he's talking. He's in the middle. It's in the era of World War I, and he's talking about on the entrance of America into the war. And his whole point is to say that listen, it's not really a big deal right now. There will, however, be a world war between Japan and the U.S. down the line because their imperial ambitions are going to collide. Prescient Lenin as ever. He also says that America will have a great deal of trouble summoning the kind of mobilization necessary for such a war because the people there do enjoy great personal freedom, which is true. Americans have geographic, regional, we've all of these things that are, not so unique or not so necessarily exceptional by themselves, but taken together create this way of life and this, fair amount of detachment from global affairs that is, as it eventually will come home to roost. Who the fuck knows when? But you can't deny that.
Yeah,
and I think that to me, to what you're saying, it's the more and more we sort of accept this position of unreality, and we just say that people places like Israel are just uncomplicated democracies that we should support to the hilt, and that we should just keep sending untold amounts of weaponry to people who not all that long ago were killing Jews. To me, it's those are ultimately It's, look, you could say that ultimately, however you want to say it went down, sending a bunch of guns and ammo into Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union blew back on the U.S. in a certain way.
Look at that. Just
wow.
So smooth the way
I didn't notice that?
Look at that. The way he promotes you just slip it right in.
Well, it seems like this El Chapo guy was running a trap house out of his villa in Mexico.
Wait, that's the wrong guest.
You know what? So to me, Tel Aviv seems like a town full of cum. So, no.
That one's pretty good.
That was pretty good. And I hope,
you should give them that one.
That's okay. Yeah. But I think with Israel, I guess it's just I have a hard time making myself care essentially about this. I mean, I think that's the case for a lot of people. It's interesting that these protests are happening. It's funny that they're calling it a civil war. But at the end of the day, the main issue that a lot of people have, or the main thing that people know about or care about in regards to Israel, isn't necessarily the ins and outs of Israeli parliamentary politics or the way that the judiciary acts, as a force in society, but it's the treatment of Palestinians, which, does actually have a lot to do with the makeup of the government now. But at the end of the day, I guess the tension here for me, it's not really a tension actually at all, is that like the protesters, like we said, are protesting for Israeli democracy, right?
Yeah.
Which is a democracy that is an apartheid democracy,
Yes.
right? Against a government that is more aggressive and has these out and out open racists instead of the sort of coded racists of some of the liberal wing. Who believe in like forced, not all like forced resettlement, but like just outright murder in the case of Ben Gvir and some of the other people in government of Palestinians. At the end of the day, though, like the status quo, even if the protesters get all of their, what they want, if they have a new, I mean, not even a liberal government, but if they get this judicial overhaul, like totally rescinded, there is still this insane military occupation. There's still the not only the blockade, but the encirclement of Gaza in this giant open air concentration camp. None of these things will fundamentally change in this. And so like for me, it's just like, and I feel sort of bad saying this in a way, but like, I just like that something kind of bad is happening to Israel. And like, I know that's sort of like probably a juvenile way to look at it, but like, I couldn't give a fuck what some Israeli liberal wants for his government.
Well, I mean, look, to that point, I think that like that gets to the heart of it, which is the question, or at least like I think like what is like the essential question, the question at the core of all of it, that a lot of people want to ask, or would would exasperatedly shout on Twitter, like, ugh, well then what is a good Israeli to do? And the answer to that is like stand with Palestinians.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if there is a way that Israeli government and society is redeemed, it's not going to begin with like shutting down the Island Highway in downtown Tel Aviv. Like that is a hell of a gesture, and it's not something that's ever happened in Israel before. But until that there are Jews who are standing up for the rights of Palestinians that live in and are getting bloodied in Jenin and Hawara, then like this isn't going to be a revolution in a positive direction.
Well, I will say there was a big outcry after we mentioned Hawara a couple times, right? This made the news in a lot of places. If you hadn't seen it, there was a pogrom.
Multiple
pogroms in a few villages. This Palestinian town Hawara by settlers. 2 Israelis had been shot, and then just hundreds of Israeli settlers descended on these Palestinian villages, burned hundreds of homes, killed a guy, beat the shit out of other people.
And to be clear, the person who used the word pogrom in the media that was most well known was a former Israeli military leader.
Yes, yeah. And to be clear also, the guy they shot wasn't the guy who shot these 2 guys. He was just a random guy. Israelis had already killed 5 people, including the gunman, they say. Although, I mean, it's fucking Israel, so who the fuck knows? Including the gunman, they say, in a different raid. So this was just purely retaliatory response against something that had already been in these people's own logic solved, but destroyed these towns. And it was a finance minister came out, and he said like, oh, 'cause he's a big settler leader. He's like, I at first, he was liking all these tweets, like basically celebrating this pogroms. And then he came out and said, well, actually, like, I don't believe that I think these were bad. I don't think that citizens should take this into their own hands. I believe that the Israeli state should have done these pogroms. And you sort of saw these Israeli liberals kind of decrying it and saying like, oh no, like this is horrible. This is this right wing, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, you believe the precise same exact thing as this person.
Also, the state is doing the pogrom.
That's what I'm saying. The state, well, if
the state lets it happen, the state is doing it.
Yeah, there's just soldiers
because that's also
there.
like the mission of soldiers. When a settler, this is like breaking the silence. The group of former Israeli soldiers, they give a lot of tours, heroic people. I went on a tour with them years ago where they I'd known the concept intellectually, but having it demonstrated was very helpful. Where like if you see Israeli settlers and Palestinians out, and they're like, let's say fighting over because the Israelis want the goats to be Palestinian goats to be, they're not allowed to eat where the Israelis want to, whatever. So if the settlers decide, all right, well, we're going to start wailing on these Palestinians and we're going to kill their goats, the job of the Israeli soldiers there, even though this would obviously, the morality of the situation is pretty clear to anybody around, the job of the Israeli soldiers is to protect the settlers.
Yeah.
What does that mean? You're basically giving these people an escort while they commit their beatdown.
Yeah. Well, not only an escort, it's like if some guy, you're a Palestinian guy and some settler starts beating the shit out of you, you start beating the shit out of him, you get shot.
Yes.
So
yes,
essentially,
yes,
like you,
yes,
it's
It's
like,
extra muscle.
Yeah, it's extra. It's someone pointing a gun at you while you get your ass kicked, or your
Right.
house burned down, or your village burned
So,
down.
you know, it's again like Israelis understandably are like skeeved out by the rhetoric because, yeah, it's skeevy rhetoric.
Yeah.
But, like, brother, that's the reality.
Well, and that's so. I guess that's, and we were talking about this before the episode started. So I guess that sort of leads me to my view on this. In that, like, you know, like I mean, I don't really support the protesters, I guess you could say, in that, like, I am almost glad that, like, this government is in here and is doing this because, you know, they are kind of giving lie to this Israeli democracy,
Yeah.
right? And this Israeli militarist ethos and this permanent state of exception, right?
Yeah.
Is they're putting, like, the thing is, like, I think at the end of the day, and I'm not speaking about everybody, but I'm speaking about sort of the mainstream here in Israeli society, the liberals, is that they're too vulgar about it. You know?
Well, that's the thing. They want that's what they're really protesting for. What they're trying to save is the mask.
Yeah, the mask.
Right?
Yeah.
They're like, we need to. You guys have to keep the mask. I mean, we need to keep the bubble. That's what it is.
Yeah.
And you know,
the
look,
bubble needs to keep its hard.
And if we want to get rid of the mask, well, somebody's going to have to stop them.
But I think to your point about like,
Sorry.
why care about this, or like how, like what's you
Yeah.
know, the kind of takeaway. I mean, something that I've been kind of thinking about. There was this, like, recently this Brazilian philosopher like came out in an interview and was talking about how what he was seeing in the world was like the Israelification of the world.
Typical for a Brazilian to say that.
Well, no, that was the point. I mean,
Yeah, I
he was
know.
saying it in like in obvious like reference to the Brazilianization of the world, and saying what we're actually seeing right now possibly is the Israelization of the world. And like you do see that actually in these you know, kind of anti-liberal, anti-whatever
Yeah.
movements all around in this moment of like extreme I don't know, volatility, popular volatility, and like political uncertainty, and institutions kind of flailing about. You see it all over Europe. You see, I mean, I don't want to sound like some kind of like New York Times person or something talking about like backsliding or whatever, but I do think that you see this kind of, I mean, you see it in the U.S.
Well, also
Florida is basically the Israel of the
I mean,
U.S.
Florida,
Yeah.
Tennessee is apparently headed there too. I think that as far as like the making like all of these places like Israel goes or something, or like whatever, like part of what is the share, right, is that like people aren't offered like a choice between like, oh, here's the good guys and the bad guys. It's here's one kind of bad guy and another kind of bad guy. And so what they end up voting on is really, do I want the status quo or do I want to change? You know, and like that was the dynamic of like the Trump election in 2016. And I think that the more and more we start putting, you know, especially voting polities like the Israeli, you know, like in Israel, start getting the option put before them of, you know, status quo or change, and the status quo just continues to feel like this unbearable interregnum, the more and more we're going to find that these change votes are not going to come out to our liking because no option that could actually yield a better future is being allowed to be presented.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. I mean, I think that's essentially what I'm saying with Israel, right? I mean, the two things on option here are the status quo, which is de facto apartheid,
Correct.
or a worse version of that.
Yes.
And I mean, that's really similar to I think how a lot of people like felt. Like you were saying in 2016 with Trump and Clinton, right? It's like, okay, well, you can have more of this, but actually almost even a little worse, or you can have Trump, right? And it's like, yeah, I mean, there's no like positive offering on hand there, but there's also like no real indication that a lot of people, just like in America, really want any kind of positive offering either.
The person whose analysis, sort of borrowing the formulation there from, was the late historian Marilyn Young, who taught mainly about the Vietnam War at NYU. But she, in this collection where she's talking about the Korean War, she talks about how in 1952, basically the American public was presented with, you know, a status quo vote for the Democrats, in that case Adlai Stevenson, and, you know, who had taken up the Truman Mantle, or Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower, you know, even though he was like a fucking general or whatever, he represented change at that moment. Yeah. And so the vast majority, like this, you know, huge amount of Americans who voted for him, it's not like they were voting because they agreed with like the new look or massive retaliation or all of these other, you know, crazy Cold War policies. They just wanted something that was different from what they viewed as like the really horrible stagnation of those final Truman years. And, that is like the more and more, again, like I was just saying, like, yeah, like that ugly choice comes up, the more and more we're just going to get ugly answers.
Yeah. Which is what brings me to my solution. And this is my
Kill the
solution
uggos.
No. This is my solution to the Ukraine war as well. It's my solution to the Chinese-Indian border.
Not
It's my
kill the
solution
uggos.
to Indian and Pakistan, for that matter. It's really my solution to any global problem involving just two parties. Introduce a third one. And for me, I think that third one should be South Korea. I think South Korea should invade Israel. Kind of just see what happens.
They're spiritual. They got some spiritual
they're-
similarities.
Yeah, okay, yes, but I feel, you know what?
They're homies.
What
They're
if we
not,
just, or maybe we could merge them,
Merge them?
Yeah.
Merge South Korea, or just switch them.
But that's kind of what I'm saying. What this guy's talking about. you
Yeah,
know? You're
fuck.
starting to
Well,
see
who can
it.
invade Israel then?
Certainly not Australia. Oh wait, they're
Fuck it,
also,
Mexico. Have Mexico invade Israel. See what
Yeah.
happens. This is my same thing. Ukraine? Fuck it. I don't know. Put in Kenya. Just sort of see what happens there. We've reached an impasse in so many of these global conflicts.
So
right?
we just need to throw in.
We just need to throw in a third guy.
Yeah.
It's like when you try to open up your marriage, and I guess that doesn't really.
Well, I
work
mean,
most
yeah,
of the
no,
time.
I get it. A lot of nations have been going at it solo poly, and now
Exactly.
they need to.
Exactly.
They need to be part of a QUL. I get it.
But my solutions to world problems aside, we got to wrap up here. Israel.
Best of luck.
Good luck, guys.
Brace,
Yeah.
real quick, before we sign off. Do you think you would survive in the John Wick universe?
Easily would survive in the John
You
Wick
think?
universe. Easily would survive. Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not.
Have you seen-
Would you be the Pigeon Man?
The bum? No. No. Here,
No,
all
he
right.
was like fake bum. Bum was costume.
Well, he's rich, but he lives in the sewer.
Morpheus, right?
Yeah. Here's what I would do in the John Wick universe. Well, there's several ways I would survive, but if you've noticed, and this is very prominent in the last movie, they block getting shot by putting their suit jackets up because they have bulletproof suits.
Which, by the way, very sick.
Yeah, my move whenever I'm going anywhere
Although very
because of my
heavy.
natural cowardice is to kind of unzip my jacket and kind
Yeah.
of go in it like sort of
Cornholio style.
Yeah, Cornholio style.
Yeah.
And so I would
He's
simply
doing
just
Cornholio.
do that. My other thing too is there's a lot of
But
guys.
they're only going to get you from the back then. So you're saying you're protected from the back, but not from the front.
No, not from the front, but my smoothing smile will disarm people.
Okay.
The other thing too is I probably wouldn't be an assassin. I would just try to have a regular job.
What would you be?
Like I don't know. I would I'd work at like a brewery or like a florist or
Oh,
something.
you mean just like outside?
Yeah.
You're like, I'm not even in the movie.
And my whole thing is I'd be like, what are these guys doing?
Yeah. You're like, I'm just a sim.
John Wick killed like 80 people in a nightclub. Like,
Yeah.
shouldn't the police be here?
You're not even on the subway.
I know, but I'd be like, why isn't anyone arresting John Wick? I get it. The other guys are bad too, but he just murdered 80 people.
But he's so cool.
I understand that, but that's not.
But obviously, the government is extremely corrupt in the John Wick universe.
I know, but then I'm like trying to like check into a hotel that's also the Flatiron Building, and they're like, actually, we only serve assassins here, and I get in a lawsuit with them because I'm like, sorry, I'm a barista. I need to stay here.
That's not a protected class. You don't
I know,
have
but I'm
any
like,
rights.
There's like a Title IX for assaints in.
Well, we don't know
John
the
Wick?
universe.
Listen, yeah.
The government system.
Well, you know what job I would not have, and which seems to be the most common job in the John Wick universe? Guys standing there, like in the headquarters.
Oh, yeah.
There are so many.
Well, there's security.
There's so many guys.
Yeah, that's security.
But
You
I'm
always
saying
need to have
like,
your guys.
What do those guys have? Like homes and families?
Of course. Grace, part of being an adult is recognizing that other people have inner lives just like you do.
No, first of all, everyone else is fake. It's like a video game, except for me. But I just don't understand why anyone lets this happen. Are there wars in John Wick?
Do you know what I would be in the John Wick universe?
Who?
Stay-at-home wife.
Stay at home to John Wick, but that didn't.
Stay at home. Me? Stay at home.
Yeah, but would you be John Wick, stay-at-home wife?
No, I just mean in general. I'm staying at
So
home.
neither of us would be John Wick.
I'm not in.
There aren't really a lot of guys like me in John Wick's
But you know
field.
what's great about the John Wick universe?
What?
Great homes. So I'm like, I'm staying here.
Crazy houses.
Yeah.
Lives in the Louvre.
Let's stay at home.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere.
I'm Liz.
My name is Brace, the maitre d' at the John Wick Hotel. We are, of course, joined by young Chomsky, and the podcast...
It's called TrueAnon. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Jeffrey Epstein.